one speaks aloud in whispering pines, because the hunger in the lake listens to every whisper, and everyone who steps into this town, sooner or later becomes its prey. In the depths of North America, in a corner unseen by maps, lay a town forgotten by time and the modern world, Whispering Pines. The irony behind the name was the fact that the townspeople never spoke above a whisper, seemingly afraid of their own murmurs. The heart of the town was in a state of perpetual twilight, shadowed by the ancient, dense pine forests that surrounded it. Tony was 25. He had come to the town to settle the will left by his father, a famous nature photographer who had vanished a decade ago, leaving behind only a neglected cabin overlooking Blackwater Lake near the town. Tony had inherited his father's adventurous spirit, but that independent soul was now replaced by cold, rational skepticism. He wanted to understand why a man who hated city lights his whole life would hide in such a desolate and suffocating place. When Tony parked his rusty, creaking pickup truck on Oak Street, the town's single main street, the first thing he noticed was the silence. This was not a natural silence. Rather, it was a tense stillness, as if all expected sounds were being forcibly suppressed. As he drove past the two-story, identical, decaying wooden houses, he caught glimpses of shadows watching him through gaps in the curtains. No one waved, no one smiled, no one even looked openly. Their faces held a blank expression, brought on by what seemed like years of weary acceptance. The small shop in the town square, Elsie's Supply Post, was Tony's first stop. The bell gave a lifeless rattle as he stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled of stale tobacco. Behind the counter sat a frail, grey-haired woman with a face etched with deep wrinkles. When their eyes met, hers glinted with the cold shine of steel. "Stranger," the woman said, her voice like rough sandpaper. "It's been a long time since we've seen a stranger here. My name is Tony Marlow. I'm here for a few days. My father." Tony paused, unsettled by the intensity of her gaze. "I'm here to find the cabin my father, David Marlow, left behind." The woman nodded slowly. Her fingers tapped an erratic rhythm on the counter's edge. "David? Yes. He was a man who loved the deep forest. It was too deep for some of us." "What happened to him?" Tony asked directly. Elsie's wrinkles deepened, as if the weight of a secret was pulling them inward. "Things get lost here, young man. Not just people, memories, sometimes sounds, sometimes even light. David was just one of the lost." Tony was not satisfied with this mystical, evasive answer. He took out his map, a rough, hand-drawn sketch that his father had included with his will. "The cabin is near Blackwater Lake. Can you show me the way?" Elsie didn't even look at the map. She tilted her head. "The cabin is on the old road. They closed it off 10 years ago. You'll have to walk into the woods to get back there. And Tony." The woman narrowed her eyes. "Only go to Blackwater Lake before the sun sets. Nothing good awaits you there." Tony dismissed her words as illogical superstition and bought the necessary supplies before heading toward the cabin. The old road soon genuinely turned into a derelict path, covered in pine needles with young trees growing up in the middle of it. Reluctantly, Tony had to leave his truck by the roadside. The forest, unlike the silence of the town, emitted a suffocating hum. But this was not the sound of animals or the wind. It was as if countless whispers echoed through the tree trunks and leaves. Tony felt watched with every step he took. After a grueling half-hour walk, The path suddenly opened into a clearing. In the center stood David Marlow's cabin. Its roof had collapsed, its wood rotted with dampness, a bleak monument. Just behind the cabin stretched the fabled Black Water Lake. The lake truly lived up to its name. The surface of the water was an inky black, swallowing all the light from the sky. There was no vegetation even at the water's edge, only bare earth and stones, as if the lake itself had sucked the life out of the surrounding forest. Tony forced the cabin door open. The air inside smelled of mold and death. On a table was a dusty typewriter with a half-finished manuscript on it. Tony leaned in to read the text. The lake is watching everything. Those sounds, they are not products of my mind. They are the breath of the forest. The town knows, but does not speak. They are just waiting. Every day a shadow grows longer. And I found out what it is. It has no name. Just the writing cut off abruptly here, as if his father had rushed away from the table. As Tony continued to search, he found a thick, leather-bound notebook, protected from the damp under the bed. Flipping through the pages, he realized it was his father's journal. Tony turned back to the first page. The entries dated from the last few months before David Marlow's disappearance. August 21st, arrived at Whispering Pines. The air is heavy, the people silent. There's not fear in their eyes, but surrender. I think the secret here is older than the town itself. September 3rd, the lake. The lake is strangely silent. When I look at its surface, I don't see my reflection. Just a deep, velvety darkness. And I thought I saw something moving in that darkness. Its dimensions, impossible. September 15th. Sounds come from the forest at night. It's not a wolf howl or an owl screech. It's the sound of breathing, slow, wet, and massive. The old townspeople say Blackwater belongs to the eater. I didn't take their words seriously, but since yesterday the pines around the cabin, they're turning black, one by one. Not like a disease. It's as if something is truly eating those trees. Tony's heart raced. Was this just his father's paranoia, or a distorted reflection of the truth? When he reached the last page of the journal, there was a single sentence, undated and written in a shaky hand. The shadow came. He closed the door, and it is observing me. The countdown has begun. Tony froze. He quickly snapped the journal shut. Just then, a sound came from the direction of the lake. It was a scraping sound, as if a large, wet mass was being dragged across stones and mud. Tony looked through the dirty window. The sun was about to set on the western horizon of the forest. The surface of the lake had grown even darker, and at its edge, right by the water, there was something abnormal. It was taller than a tree, yet it had no definite shape. It was just a dark mass, as if a piece of the lake's darkness had leaked onto the land. Tony's rational side screamed alarms. Shine a light on it. It's an animal, an illusion. Tony grabbed his flashlight and, opening the window, aimed the beam at the mass. The weak light hit the thing, and a small, momentary sheen appeared on the mass's surface. And in that moment, Tony saw the thing change shape. It rapidly shrank, condensed, and then transformed into a human-like silhouette. It was Tony himself. The entity that had become Tony tilted its head slightly and smiled. Its eyes were like two glowing embers in the flashlight beam. The entity opened its mouth. Its voice echoed in Tony's mind, a deep, ancient whisper that touched his very nerves. "Welcome, David's son. I have been waiting for you. The game must begin." Tony's hand trembled, and the flashlight dropped to the floor. rolling away into the darkness. In the instant it fell, the reflection thing changed shape again and silently retreated into the depths of Blackwater Lake. But the image that remained in Tony's mind was his own face, bearing that deep, ominous smile. This town had caused his father's disappearance. Now the town was trying to claim Tony. Tony bolted out of the cabin. His eyes were wide with the horror he had just witnessed. He plunged into the forest, running back the way he had come. What Tony didn't know yet was that every resident of the town knew he had arrived at the cabin that night, and they were all waiting for the entity to begin its hunt. Tony was running back down the old road, his lungs burning, his chest hammering wildly with panic. That ominous whisper, "David's son," echoing in his mind, propelled him faster with every step. This wasn't a hallucination. His father's journal, Blackwater Lake, and that reflected silhouette. All of it had broken Tony's chain of logic. Something in this town existed outside the physical laws he knew. Finally, he reached his truck. He jumped inside and put the key in the ignition. His hand was shaking, and it took him several tries to start the engine. Tires spun, kicking up pine needles, and Tony sped back towards Oak Street without looking back. He had left his father's journal and any other remaining mementos in the cabin. It was the last thing he cared about right now. His sole goal was to get away from this accursed place as fast as possible. But when he reached Oak Street, he realized the town would not let him go. The street was utterly different from before. The town that had seemed quiet and tense when he arrived was now expectant. In front of every house just outside the door stood a single person. Old, young, men, women. All of them were turned towards Tony's truck, standing motionless like statues. There was no hostility or curiosity in their eyes, just cold, lifeless observation. Tony slowed the truck. Not a single head turned, not a single hand waved. This felt like a collective display. A warning. Tony kept the window up, pressed the pedal, and headed for the town's exit. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He just needed to get onto the interstate as soon as possible. The exit from Whispering Pines was at the very end of the main street, where a worn goodbye sign stood. But when Tony got there, he saw that the exit was closed. The road was completely blocked by a massive oak tree. The tree was so heavy it would be impossible for a single person to move it. It looked like a job that would take days, maybe weeks. But Tony had only arrived a few hours ago. Fear was now numbing his brain. He got out of the truck and pulled out his cell phone. No signal. Nowhere. As Tony approached the tree, he knew the townspeople behind him were still watching. He turned back. When he walked into Elsie's supply post, the woman was sitting behind the counter with her knitting. The clinking of her knitting needles was the only sound in the vicinity. "The road is closed, Elsie," Tony said, his voice trembling with panic. "That huge tree. I can't get past it." Elsie continued knitting without looking at Tony. "I know, Tony. That tree was there when your father David first came here. It's an obstacle for those who want to leave." "But it wasn't there when I arrived," Tony shouted. "This is impossible." Elsie finally looked up. There was no sympathy or fear in her eyes, just a weary understanding. "Whispering Pines doesn't like those who want to leave, young man, especially after the Shadow has noticed you." The Shadow. That thing in Blackwater Lake. My father wrote about it in his journal. What does it mean? Elsie slowly put down her knitting. She leaned down and pulled a bound book from under the counter. The book was pitch black, like charred leather. "We call this the Eater's Ledger. It has been passed down through generations in our town for hundreds of years. That entity, the thing that emerged from black water, we don't see it as a god. It is a process. It is a hunger. Elsie opened a page in the ledger. The drawings on the page were abstract and horrific, a shapeless mass emerging from the deep lake waters, constantly mimicking human form. The eater does not just consume souls or bodies, it consumes all the potential a person holds. It gains strength by draining a person's hope, their future, their joy of living. And when it does this, it changes everything around it. The road was closed by the shadow. The hope of returning has been stolen by the shadow. My father. Tony's voice was strained. What happened to my father then? Did he become the shadow? Elsie shook her head slowly. No. David had a very strong potential. Instead of consuming him completely, the eater stored him. It keeps him somewhere under the lake as a kind of energy reserve. Everything that remains of your father draws the eater here even more powerfully. Tony backed away in horror. Why are you telling me this? Why are the others just watching me? Because, Elsie said, and a flicker of genuine pain appeared in her eyes for the first time. I also had a son. Years ago. He also tried to leave, like David. The town wouldn't allow it. The eater took him too. All that is left for me is to stay here and wait. You, Tony, you are the eater's newest prey, and warning you is the last shred of my conscience. Elsie closed the ledger and pushed it toward Tony. This book contains something about how we can slow the eater down. You can't destroy it, but maybe you can trick it. If you want to find out what happened to your father, go to the town's old library. There is another map that belongs to your father. It shows the location of the energy reserve under the lake. But be careful, that library, it is one of the eater's hunting grounds. Tony's hands trembled as he took the ledger. Where is the library? At the end of Oak Street, across from the church. But the sun has set, and when you step outside, the townspeople will move. Tony turned his head to the shop window. It was pitch black outside. No lights were on. The outside was enveloped in an inky blackness. The townspeople were no different from the shadows, waiting for Tony to make a move. Why? Tony whispered. Why will they stop me? Elsie's voice was a mere whisper. The eater needs a price. To maintain the balance, the townspeople believe they will be safe for a while longer by sacrificing you. They want the eater to take you instead of themselves or their families. You will be the town's ticket out for a little while longer, Tony. Tony felt a cold dagger stab him in the back. The town's silence was actually part of a bargain to trap him. Elsie gave one last warning. If you hear a whisper, don't answer. It can imitate voices. If you hear it, just run. Tony slammed the door and bolted out of the shop. The darkness of the night swallowed him. Oak Street, which he reached shortly, was like a labyrinth. The silhouettes waiting in front of the houses were gone, or Tony couldn't distinguish them in the dark. The library was only 100 meters away. Tony, unwilling to stay outside any longer, started to run. Just then, he heard a voice from the depths of the street, echoing directly in his mind. It was his father's voice. Tony, son, don't look back. You have to hide. It is waiting for you in the library. Tony hesitated. He closed his eyes. He remembered Elsie's warning. It can imitate voices. But the voice was so real, so much his father's, that Tony paused. Just at that moment, a figure slowly and clumsily emerged from the shadowed front door of the library. Tony's eyes clearly picked out the two bright embers glowing in the dark. The figure was again a shapeless mass, its pitch black, glossy skin reflecting the moonlight. For a fleeting moment, the pale face of David Marlow appeared on the entity's glossy skin. Though his expression seemed to be one of suffering, his mouth was stretched into that ominous, wide smile. "Run, Tony," his father whispered, "or come and take my place." His voice had changed and taken on an ominous tone. The figure began to slither toward Tony. Though it wasn't the speed of a running man, its confident gait was terrifying. Tony was about to confront the entity that was mimicking his father's face. He was frozen on the thin line between going toward his father and running away. On the reflecting surface of the approaching thing, a second face began to appear next to his father's face. It was the face of a young, scared Tony who didn't know what to do. Tony's mind shattered. He had to run. In desperation, he started to sprint toward the library door. The entity's gigantic hand-like extension was trying to grab the empty space right behind him. Tony pushed the door open and threw himself inside the library. Though he felt safer, the air inside was heavier than outside. The smell of dust and mold mixed with a scent like blood. And the silence inside was even deeper and more deadly. Tony had entered the hunting ground. He shoved the thick oak door shut behind him. The rusty latch of the lock slid into place with a loud click. The darkness outside was less suffocating compared to the one inside. The library was no ordinary building. This was the place of the town's forgotten memories, silent screams, and the eater's first harvest. Tony's flashlight beam danced across the cracked and dusty bookshelves that reached up to the ceiling. The suspended odor of mold, damp paper, and stale blood formed a sickening mixture. This place had been long forgotten, abandoned. But as Tony's footsteps echoed on the building's old wooden floor, the silence felt more like a deliberate state of waiting. Elsie's warning, his father's imitated voice, and that reflected horror were causing chaos in Tony's mind. He had come here to find his father's second map, the map of the energy reserve under the lake. Tony knew his father was not a librarian or a historian. He was a photographer. David Marlow must have hidden his map in an illogical place. Tony started moving through the aisles of shelves, looking for his father's photography notes or any personal belongings. The weak light of the flashlight hit the reading table in the center of the room. A shiny metal object reflected from beneath the layer of dust on the table. Tony approached. It looked like a part of his father's tripod. On it was a small, barely legible note scratched in David Marlow's handwriting. "Beneath the shadow that swallows the shadow." Tony frowned as he read this cryptic note. The shadow that swallows the shadow. The only known shadow in town was the eater in Blackwater Lake. What was the shadow that swallowed the eater? Tony looked around. All the windows in the library were shuttered, so there was no natural light. However, a faint, flickering beam of light drew attention from the depths of the building. The light was seeping from behind an old, large bookshelf in the library's farthest corner. Tony walked toward that direction. His heart pounded in his chest with every step he took in the dusty corridors between the shelves. When he reached the back of the giant shelf, he raised his flashlight. Among hundreds of bound books on the shelf, one book stood out, darker than the others, seemingly absorbing light. The book itself was like the shadow that swallows the shadow. The book's cover was a velvety blackness, with no title on it. Instead of just grabbing and pulling the book, Tony remembered his father's note. Beneath the shadow, where he was holding the book, he felt a void close to the floor, at the bottom edge of the shelf. He knelt down, holding the flashlight. At the bottom of the bookshelf, a small, locked box was fixed to the floor. The box was made of metal, and its surface was smooth. It looked new, even though the shelves were coated in centuries of dust. He needed a key to open the box. As Tony started searching the surroundings, he felt things changing between the shelves. The air temperature had dropped. Tony's breath was now condensing in the dim air, and that sound, the whisper, had returned. This time, the whisper was not David Marlow's voice. It was the whisper of a much younger man, in pain. "You're in the wrong place. This was my place. Don't go back. He sacrificed you." Tony turned his head, following the voice. The sound was coming from the shelf right next to him. There was a dusty stack of books there. The topmost book seemed to be vibrating in place. Tony reached out his hand and pulled the book. The title was Whispering Pines, Archive of Lost Faces. Tony opened the book. All the photos inside belonged to people who had disappeared from the town over the years. Flipping quickly through the pages, he saw a familiar name, Elsie's young son. The date below the photo was 2 years before David Marlow came to town. When Tony turned to the next page, his heart nearly stopped. There was a photograph of a young man, handsome, with smiling eyes, and under the photo, Tony Marlow. No, this was impossible. The date below the photograph, it read September 30th, 2025. The date Tony had arrived in town. The photo was recent, but most chillingly, the young man in the photo had that same terrifying, grim smile Tony had seen in the eater's reflection. Tony dropped the book in horror. He'd seen his own future added to this archive. Just then, he heard that wet, scraping sound again coming from the door. The eater was moving within the library through the labyrinth of aisles. Time was running out. Tony returned to the box. He looked again at the book, The Shadow That Swallows the Shadow. The book represented the dark soul of the library. He aimed the flashlight at the book's thick spine. Under the layer of dust, he saw a faint, shining set of letters barely discernible. DM. David Marlow's initials. Tony pulled the book off the shelf. When the book fell, the shelf panel underneath it shifted, and a small key was revealed. The key was rusty and old. Tony quickly inserted the key into the box lock and turned it. Click. The box opened. Inside the box was a worn map, about the size of David Marlow's notebook. The map paper showed the detailed topography of Blackwater Lake. In the center of the map, at the deepest point of the lake, an X was drawn in red ink, and next to the X was the note. The reserve. This is it. I sealed it before it could swallow this place. If the seal is broken, only a reflection remains. Strike it with something fragile. Tony didn't exactly know what it meant, but this was a salvation gifted to him by his father. He tucked the map into his pants pocket. At that moment, the scraping sound was getting closer and closer. The eater had passed through one of the aisles and entered the main area of the library. Tony carefully peeked around the edge of the shelf where he was hiding. The shapeless mass was hovering in the dim, dark area of the library. Its reflecting surface now showed different faces. The face of Elsie's lost son, the screaming face of David Marlow, and Tony's own scared face. The eater was reflecting all the potential it had gathered on a single surface. It slowly turned toward where Tony was. Somehow, it sensed his presence. At that moment, hundreds of voices echoed in Tony's mind. I'm here, come and take me. I'm tired of suffering, take me too. These were the last desires of the victims the Eater had consumed before. They were being used to confuse Tony's mind. Tony panicked and hid behind the shelves. As he retreated, his flashlight beam hit a large, round, cracked wall clock resting on the table. Strike it with something fragile. His father's note resonated in his mind. Though crazy and impossible, an idea struck Tony. If the Eater was a reflecting mass, could fragile materials like light and glass disrupt its non-physical form? Tony quickly ran toward the table. He knew the Eater was watching him. The shapeless mass began to rapidly slither toward Tony. Tony grabbed the clock. The Eater was only 5 meters away from Tony. On its reflecting surface, his father's face lunged toward Tony. "Come and take my place, Tony." With all his strength, Tony hurled the clock toward the Eater's reflecting surface. Crash! The clock hit its target. The glass shattered. The fragmented clock glass and metal mass hit the Eater's reflecting surface, and a giant noise erupted. The Eater froze for a moment. As the reflecting surface rippled like a stone thrown into a puddle, the shapes instantly vanished. From within the mass, instead of human whispers, a deep, ancient, and animalistic scream arose. This was its true sound. The mass recoiled in pain and quickly shrank toward the back wall of the library, disappearing as if being swallowed by a shadow. Tony was out of breath. He had succeeded. He had stopped it for a short while. But a few minutes later, he heard whispers coming from outside the library door, from the town. The townspeople were talking about Tony. He had to escape the library immediately. He had found the map. Now his sole aim was to reach the lake, and to do that, he had to go through the town. Silence returned to the library, but this silence couldn't suppress the noise in Tony's mind. Tony tried to slow his heartbeat and felt the worn map in his pocket. His father, David Marlow, had not found a way to escape this cursed town, but a way to seal the center of this horror. Tony opened the door and burst out of the library. The night was now darker than the color of the ink, a tangible threat. Oak Street was dim and damp. The entire town seemed to be sleeping. Not a single light was on, but Tony knew he was being watched. Tony started running toward his truck. However, before he could get close to the vehicle, he suddenly sensed a movement in the street. The doors of the houses began to open, all at the same time, slowly and with chilling synchronization. Tony stopped. His face turned toward the grim houses. Emerging from the door gaps, the townspeople walked into the middle of the street in a single file, with heavy steps. Each one had become a lifeless wall blocking the street from end to end to stop Tony. They were like a transfixed, sleepwalking, drunken crowd. Their eyes were open, but their gaze reflected no emotion. It was as if an external force was manipulating their bodies like puppets. Tony shouted, "Let me pass. That thing will take you too. All of you. I'm just trying to break the spell." The answer came from the mouths of all the townspeople at once. "He gives us peace. You are his food. Don't go. Stay and feed us." Tony understood that these people were beyond saving. They were shadows under the Eater's influence, serving him. He couldn't fight so many people. Tony quickly changed direction. Since the crowd had blocked the way to his truck, he had to reach Blackwater Lake by going through the narrow alleyways behind the library. He started running. The townspeople pursued him, whispering in chorus. Their speed wasn't surprising, but their determination was lethal. Tony jumped over rusty fences. He heard someone's breath cut off behind him. An elderly woman had tripped over the fence and fallen. The others didn't stop to help her. They just walked around her, continuing to follow Tony. They had only one goal: to deliver Tony to the Eater. When he entered a narrow alleyway, his path was suddenly cut off by two people. These were the two burly young men who had observed Tony in Elsie's shop. Their eyes were as dull as the others, but they held thick, pruned oak branches in their hands. "Stop, stranger," one said, his voice echoing. "Your time is up." It was too late to turn back now. He had to reach the lake. Tony crouched down and threw a handful of mud and gravel he had picked up from the ground into the young man's face. The man's eyes squeezed shut with a cry of pain. Tony seized the opportunity, slipped between the two of them, and kept running. The mud and gravel had been enough to distract these people under the Eater's influence, if not the Eater itself. Tony finally reached the wooded area behind the grim houses of Whispering Pines. He was pushing through dense vegetation among the trees, parallel to the old road. As he went deeper into the forest, the townspeople's whispers faded, but the disappearing whispers were replaced by something more chilling. This time, the whisper wasn't coming from people, but from the forest itself. Every leaf, every branch of the trees was whispering Tony's name. "Too nigh. You are here. You are here." This was the Eater's way of communicating with him directly, using the forest. Its potential was spread throughout the entire vicinity of the town. Tony pulled out the map from his pocket while running. In the faint light of his flashlight, he examined the map. On the north shore of Blackwater Lake, there was a drawing of a very old and large tree marked as the Witch's Oak. The map indicated a small outcrop facing the lake right below this tree. Seal Point. As Tony made his way through the forest to find the oak, he constantly saw something moving among the trees and shadows. It wasn't the Eater itself. The Eater must have been wounded at the library and retreated to the depths of the lake, but the energy it left behind was constantly tracking Tony. Tony stopped when he crashed into a large rock and raised his flashlight. In front of him, finally, the enormous, gnarled trunk of the Witch's Oak towered. The tree's branches seemed to be bent and driven into the earth by years of despair and agony. The ground around the tree, again, was bare and dead, just like around Blackwater Lake. Tony quickly moved to the side of the tree facing the lake. There should be a small rocky outcrop there. His father's X mark on the map pointed right here. As he approached the outcrop, he saw symbols carved into the damp rock. They resembled the abstract drawings in his father's notebook, but they were arranged more systematically. Tony knelt down and hurriedly cleaned the mossy rock. In the very center of the symbols was a smooth, palm-sized metal plate. This must be the seal mentioned. A warning note was added next to the seal on the map. Strike it with something fragile. Tony had used the clock glass, but now he had nothing fragile and reflective in his hand. Just at that moment, the whispers from the forest rose again, and he heard a movement closer to him. "Stop, Tony. Don't break it." It was Elsie's voice. Tony looked up. Elsie emerged from the trees with two townspeople behind her. The woman's face held more than the weariness from the shop. Now there was a determined, almost crazed expression. "What have you done, Elsie?" Tony's voice was full of anger. "I did it for my son," Elsie cried out. "My son's soul is locked in that energy reserve of the Eater. If you break this seal, my son's energy will be completely sucked into the Eater. Everything will end. The hope of the entire town, including mine, will end." Tony was stunned. Elsie had warned him, but now she was trying to stop him. The hopes of the townspeople were locked in the Eater's captivity. The only way to get back his potential is to free him, Elsie, Tony shouted. My father's note says so. The two men next to Elsie lunged at Tony. Tony quickly ducked and grabbed a sharp-edged stone fragment he found on the rocky ground. The stone was his only weapon. As the men pounced on Tony, Tony made a quick move. He brought the stone down on the glass of his flashlight. Crack! The flashlight glass shattered. Tony, holding the broken glass, quickly leaned toward the metal seal. Elsie's scream echoed through the forest. No, don't! Tony plunged the sharp edge of the broken flashlight glass right into the center of the metal plate, into the X mark David Marlow had drawn. As Tony scraped the flashlight glass across the surface of the seal, a bright electric blue light radiated out. Simultaneously, the surface of Blackwater Lake began to violently tremble. A giant vortex formed in the middle of the lake's pitch-black water. The vortex was trying to suck in not only the water, but the air, the whispers, and all the darkness of the town. Elsie and the other townspeople lost their balance with the force of the vortex. A thin, smoky purple light began to rise from their bodies. Tony looked back and saw the townspeople slowly and agonizingly giving back all the peace the Eater had provided them. As he backed away from the seal, he felt something massive approaching the surface from the bottom of Blackwater Lake. One last reflection appeared on the surface. Hundreds of silhouettes appeared on the reflecting surface, forming a layer that melted like a candle. This was the collective face of all the Eater's victims. Tony was about to free his father's potential and all the lost souls of the town. But there was a price to pay for doing so. The Eater would also be freed. When he looked towards Blackwater Lake, the reflecting surfaces in the very center of the vortex rippled one last time. Then, a pure, shapeless and scarlet shadow rose from the depths of the lake, unlike anything reflected before. The entity rising from Blackwater Lake was unlike anything Tony had ever seen. It was neither a reflecting silhouette nor an animal. It was a pure color. From the pitch-black surface of the lake, a mass like smoke, in the darkest, bloodiest shade of scarlet, coiled and rose toward the sky. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This was the Scarlet Shadow, the true, pure form of the Eater, freed after hundreds of years of captivity. With the breaking of the seal, the air around the Witch's Oak was filled with a suffocating burst of energy. Elsie and the other townspeople were on their knees, watching the ascent of the purple smoke separating from their bodies. This smoke was the potential of peace and surrender the Eater had given them. Now that energy was being taken back, leaving them as only empty and exhausted bodies. The Shadow's voice now resonated in Tony's mind with the greatest power yet. I am free. Every cell of Tony's being trembled with this ancient, hungry roar. The Scarlet Shadow was getting closer. Tony had only a momentary chance to plan his next move. He couldn't run. His truck was far away, and the townspeople were immobilized. His only chance lay in the last note on his father's map. Despite his trembling fingers, Tony pulled the map from his pocket. The intense heat and energy radiating from the Scarlet Shadow felt like it would set the paper on fire. Finally, he read the note aloud. It will be freed. But its hunger is endless. Its potential relies on one thing, the imitation of the human form. It is an entity of envy. You cannot feed it with your own potential, blind it with your own truth. Blind it with your own truth, Tony whispered. Did this mean a physical attack wouldn't work? The Scarlet Shadow was now directly in front of Tony. The smoky scarlet began to envelop him. The cold, damp air was replaced by a scorching heat. ready to suck out all of Tony's hope and life energy. Although he tried to run, a kind of numbness brought on by the energy rooted him to the spot. If he gave up, the Scarlet Shadow would consume him in a second. Tony's eyes fell on his father's map. Just below the map paper, there was another worn photograph. Tony hadn't noticed it when he first arrived here. This was David Marlow's last photograph. In the photo, David was standing in front of his cabin with his camera in hand, smiling as he looked at Blackwater Lake. This photograph seemed like one of his father's happiest moments, a photograph of a man living his passion for photography to the fullest. It was truth. A lightning bolt struck Tony's brain. The eater fed on the reflection of the human form. It consumed not only potential, but also lies and fear. Tony had come here hoping his father was still alive, but his father was dead. Tony tucked his father's last photograph into his pocket and took a step toward the Scarlet Shadow. "You were a reflection," Tony shouted, his voice faint amid the terrifying roar. "You were a monster reflected by black water, but my father..." Tony hurled his father's last photograph, which he held in his palm, toward the center of the Scarlet Shadow. "My father was a strong potential you imitated, but this is his truth." The photograph merged with the Scarlet Shadow's smoke. In that moment, the Scarlet Shadow showed a reaction it had never displayed before. At the point of contact with the photograph, the smoky mass began to vibrate and rapidly tried to imitate the smiling, happy face in David Marlow's photograph. But this was not a flawless reflection like before. As the Scarlet Shadow tried to mimic his father's smile, its shape became more distorted, as if its scarlet color was being contaminated. In the mind of the Scarlet Shadow, David Marlow's pure happiness resonated. David was content with his life when he took that photograph. The potential the eater had absorbed came from David's final moments filled with fear, not his truth. The truth Tony hurled was collapsing the eater's foundations of lies. The Scarlet Shadow let out a colossal scream. This time, it was filled with pain and rage. The mass rapidly began to pull inward. The scarlet, which even reached the branches over the witch's oak, suddenly descended toward the surface of Blackwater Lake. Elsie raised her head. Her eyes were filled with tears, but the expression of surrender on her face was gone. Now, there was a sad but free expression. In a last moment of desperation, the Scarlet Shadow tried to invade Tony's mind. "Take me. I am your father. I will never leave you. Let me consume you and live forever." Tony violently shook his head. That voice was his father's, but the hunger behind it belonged to the eater. "No," Tony said, his voice resolute. "You are just a shadow, and shadows perish with light." The Scarlet Shadow plunged into the vortex right in the middle of Blackwater Lake. The water briefly flashed with the scarlet of the shadow, and then the lake became its usual pitch black, but calm. The roar ended. The surface of the lake flattened. The suffocating twilight feeling around the town slowly dispersed. The sky, for the first time in a decade, began to look truly bright. Tony, exhausted, collapsed onto the roots of the witch's oak. The townspeople around him were still on the ground, but they were now free. Elsie slowly stood up. Her face was old and tired, but the light of life was shining in her eyes again. She staggered toward Tony. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I blinded it with truth," Tony replied, "with my father's truth. What it tried to reflect now is not fear, but happiness." Elsie slowly looked at Blackwater Lake. The lake was no longer threatening, just cold and deep. My son. Elsie's voice turned into a sob. They are gone. Tony knew his father was gone forever. The Eater had consumed him. But now, the Eater's potential reserve was gone with him. The town was freed from its bondage. Tony got up from beside Elsie. He started walking toward Oak Street. As the sun began to rise, the fallen oak tree that had blocked the town's exit was no longer there. It was a trap created by the Eater. When the Eater disappeared, the illusion it created was also gone. Tony walked to his truck. He got in and turned the key. The engine instantly rumbled. He drove toward the town exit. This time, the windows of the houses on Oak Street were closed. No one was watching him. It was as if the whole town had fallen into a deep, healing sleep. As Tony drove past the worn goodbye sign of Whispering Pines, he looked in the rearview mirror. The town remained silent and desolate, shadowed by the pine forests. But it no longer carried a dark secret. Tony drove onto the main road. The fate of the town he left behind depended on whether the Eater would return. But Tony, David Marlow's son, had completed his mission. Perhaps he couldn't save his father, but he had freed the souls of hundreds of people. The Scarlet Shadow was gone. For now. As Tony entered the highway, he took one last look in his rearview mirror. Something odd caught his eye. A thin, almost invisible strand of scarlet smoke was rising into the sky from where Blackwater Lake was located. And in that moment, Tony's own voice echoed in his mind. Just wait. Watch my return. Tony slammed on the brakes. Fear had seized him again. He was not just a hero. He had also become the Eater's last and greatest potential. Perhaps this was not just an end. Perhaps this was the beginning of a new and terrifying reign in Whispering Pines.